Romans is known as the greatest letter ever written. It is the cathedral of the Christian faith, the masterpiece of grace. But if you open to the first chapter, the masterpiece does not begin with grace. It begins with something most readers do not know what to do with. Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, is pure light. Paul introduces himself to a church he has never visited. He talks about the gospel. He talks about faith. He builds to that famous climax in verse 17, writing that the righteous will live by faith. It sounds exactly like the book of Romans we expect. But then comes verse 18. Without a gentle transition, without a warning, the tone completely fractures. The text says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." That transition is jarring. It is meant to be. Most people think of Romans as a detailed explanation of God's love, forgiveness, and mercy, and it is. But Paul does not open his explanation of the good news with the good news. He opens it with a storm. He deliberately starts his greatest theological work with an anchor of heavy, unyielding judgment. Why does the letter, famous for justification by faith, begin with the wrath of God? If Paul wants to unify his audience in Rome, why does his opening argument sound like an attack? Most people assume Paul is just getting the bad news out of the way. They think he is simply listing the sins of the ancient pagan world to make his readers appreciate Jesus more. They read chapter 1 as a generic warning. But Paul is not just making a list of bad behavior, and he is not trying to scare anyone. He is doing something much more brilliant and much more dangerous. He is building a trap. He is constructing a theological and psychological mirror. Paul structures his letter this way to systematically dismantle every human system of self-righteousness. He knows that grace means absolutely nothing to a person who believes they do not really need it. The good news cannot be truly understood until the bad news is felt in the bones. Not just acknowledged, felt, not a mild mistake, a terminal condition, not a minor flaw, a total collapse. Paul knows that the human heart is wired to deflect blame. We naturally compare ourselves to others. We find someone who looks worse than we do, and we use their failure as our shield. To show the readers in Rome the true architecture of their redemption, Paul first has to show them the absolute ruin of their own independence. He has to strip away every defense mechanism. He has to prove that both the deeply religious and the completely irreligious are standing on the exact same collapsing ground. He has to show them that no one is safe. The wrath of God is not the opposite of the gospel. In the architecture of Romans, it is the dark velvet backdrop that allows the diamond of grace to finally catch the light. If you skip over the wrath, you do not get a more loving God. You just get a cheaper grace. But to understand why Paul starts in the dark, and to see the subtle trap he is laying for his readers, we first have to understand what he is actually talking about. Because when most modern readers see the word wrath, they imagine an unpredictable deity losing his temper. They imagine anger slipping out of control. But that is not what the text says. To see what Paul actually means by the wrath of God, we have to look at the word he uses. And when we do, the judgment of chapter 1 becomes far more terrifying. When we hear the word wrath, we project our own human failures onto God. We imagine a loss of temper. We picture an emotional outburst, an unpredictable rage, or a divine temper tantrum. We think of a pagan deity throwing lightning bolts at people who break the rules. If that is what wrath means, then the opening of Romans sounds like a terrifying threat. But the word Paul uses in the text is the Greek word orge. In ordinary usage, it does not mean a sudden, unpredictable explosion of anger. The word begins with the idea of something swelling or rising slowly, like sap rising in a tree or water rising in a river. It is not a sudden loss of control. It is a settled, deep, and steady opposition. In the biblical pattern, the wrath of God is his holy, unyielding resistance to everything that destroys what he loves. It is not a temper tantrum. It is perfect justice. But Paul does something surprising here. He does not just name the wrath of God. He explains exactly what it looks like in human history. And his description is completely different from what we usually expect. When we think of divine judgment, we think of fire falling from the sky. We think of sweeping destruction. But look at how Paul describes the wrath of God in Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 28. He repeats one devastating phrase 3 different times. God gave them over. God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts. God gave them over to shameful lusts. God gave them over to a depraved mind. This clarifies how we are supposed to read the chapter. The wrath of God, in this specific passage, is not God actively striking people down from the clouds. It is a sorrowful, deliberate stepping back. The deepest judgment God can hand down is to simply remove his protective hand and allow humanity to have exactly what it wants, without interference. Not a violent attack, a tragic release. Not God forcing punishment upon people. God allowing humanity to experience the absolute emptiness of its own rebellion. For the ancient readers in Rome, this made perfect sense. They lived in the capital of the empire. They walked the streets of the most powerful city on earth. But underneath the white marble and the military power, the culture was collapsing. It was a world of absolute exploitation, rampant idolatry, casual cruelty, and moral decay. Paul is telling his readers that the chaos of the Roman Empire is not a sign that God has lost control. The chaos is the consequence. The fact that humanity is tearing itself apart is the proof that God has handed society over to the terrible weight of its own independence. If you are reading this letter as a highly religious person in the first century, you are probably cheering right about now. You know the pagan world is corrupt. You know the Roman Empire is dark. When Paul spends the second half of chapter 1 listing all the terrible, destructive sins of the ancient world, you are nodding your head. You agree completely. You feel safe because Paul is talking about those people out there. The idolaters, the pagans, the deeply broken society out in the streets. It seems like Paul is aiming all his fire at the corrupt pagan empire of Rome, but he is actually setting a trap for someone else. Let us imagine the first readers of this letter, the Jewish Christians and the highly moral Gentile believers in the Roman Church. They have just listened to Paul describe a world descending into darkness. They have heard the long list of ancient sins at the end of chapter 1. They are comfortable. They are probably nodding. They know exactly who Paul is talking about. He is talking about the emperor. He is talking about the corrupt politicians. He is talking about the chaotic streets of the city. Then the reader turns to chapter 2, and the trap snaps shut. Romans chapter 2, verse 1, begins with a sudden, sharp pivot. Paul writes, "You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." Notice what just happened. The camera abruptly swings around. The lens is no longer pointed at the pagan world. It is pointed directly at the reader. Paul has just spent an entire chapter getting the religious, moral reader to agree that human rebellion is destructive. He got them to agree that God is completely just to hand a decaying society over to its own consequences. But the moment the moralist says amen to the judgment of the pagan, Paul holds up a mirror. He says, "You do the exact same things." That sounds like a massive exaggeration. The moral person says, "I do not do those things. I am not an idolater. I am not out in the streets causing chaos. I keep the rules. I go to the synagogue. I belong to the church. I read the scriptures." But Paul is doing something deeper here. He is stripping away the illusion of moral superiority. He knows that the religious person might not commit the visible, chaotic sins of the empire, but they commit the exact same core rebellion in the quietness of their own hearts. They may not worship a statue of a Roman emperor, but they worship their own self-righteousness. They may not exploit people physically, but they look down on them with bitter pride. They use their morality not to love God, but to elevate themselves above everyone else. And in the biblical pattern, pride is just as destructive as paganism. Not a different kind of problem. The exact same disease, just wearing better clothes. This is the brilliant tension of the opening chapters. The people who thought they were perfectly safe suddenly realize they are standing in the exact same courtroom as the people they were just judging. Paul is showing them that their religious rule-keeping is not a ladder to heaven. It is just another way of hiding from God. If the wrath of God, in chapter 1, was a tragic release of the pagan world to its own desires, the wrath of God in chapter 2 is the complete shattering of the religious world's pride. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random list of theological points. Paul is sweeping through the ancient world. First, he corners the irreligious. Then, he corners the religious. He is systematically proving that human goodness is an absolute myth. He is leveling the ground. And once you see that, the next scene makes more sense. Because Paul is not finished. He has dealt with the pagan. He has dealt with the moralist. But he still has to bring both of them together under one final, devastating verdict. To understand what Paul is doing in these opening chapters, we have to look at the people actually holding the letter. We often read Romans as a theology textbook, but it was not written to a classroom. It was written to a fractured, divided, and deeply tense community. The church in Rome was in the middle of a cultural crisis. Years earlier, the Roman Emperor Claudius had expelled all the Jewish people from the city. For years, the Christian church in Rome was left entirely to the Gentiles. They developed their own rhythms, their own leadership, and their own culture. But eventually, Claudius died. The edict was lifted. The Jewish Christians returned to their homes, and they walked back into a church they no longer recognized. The tension was immediate. The Jewish believers looked at the Gentile believers and saw a lack of reverence for the law. They saw people who did not keep the traditions, who did not eat kosher, and who seemed dangerously close to the pagan culture. On the other side, the Gentile believers looked at the Jewish believers and saw arrogant traditionalists trying to drag them backward into an outdated system of rules. They were judging each other. They were drawing lines. They were creating a hierarchy of holiness. This is why Paul does not start his letter with a gentle reminder to get along. He knows that polite advice cannot heal a division this deep. If he just tells them to be kind, the hierarchy remains. The Jewish believer will still secretly think they are morally superior. The Gentile believer will still secretly think they are spiritually enlightened. To create real unity, Paul has to destroy the foundation of their pride. He has to prove that neither side has any advantage. This brings us to Romans chapter 3, verse 9. Paul asks the ultimate question. He writes, "What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin." That phrase changes the entire landscape of the letter. Under the power of sin. Paul is showing them that sin is not just a list of bad actions. It is a power. It is a ruling force. And it does not care whether you have a pagan background or a deeply religious pedigree. It dominates both equally. The pagan is enslaved by their passions. The moralist is enslaved by their pride. The symptoms look different, but the disease is exactly the same. This is the great leveler. Paul's sequence of bad news is not a weapon to hurt the church. It is a surgical tool to save it. By systematically removing every human defense, Paul places the religious insider and the pagan outsider on the exact same ground. He removes the illusion of the moral ladder. If everyone is under the power of sin, there is no room for arrogance. You cannot look down on the person sitting next to you when you both desperately need the exact same rescue. The bad news is the only thing that can prepare them to share the same grace. But Paul knows that human pride is incredibly stubborn. He knows that even now, some readers are still clinging to the idea that they are at least a little bit better than the rest of the world. They still think they have some small spark of natural goodness left to offer God. So, before he can introduce the light, Paul has to extinguish that final spark. This brings Paul to the climax of his dark sequence, an autopsy of the human condition that leaves absolutely no room for debate. To extinguish that final spark of human pride, Paul does not use a philosophical argument. He uses poetry, but it is the darkest, most devastating poetry in the entire New Testament. In Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 10, Paul weaves together a series of quotes from the Old Testament. He pulls from the Psalms. He pulls from the prophet Isaiah. But he is not just quoting random verses to prove a point. He is performing a theological autopsy on the human race. He begins with a sweeping statement. He writes, "There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away." Notice the absolute nature of the language. No one, all, not even one. Paul is systematically shutting every door. He is bolting every escape route. He is ensuring that no reader, whether they are a first-century religious scholar or a modern churchgoer, can say, "Well, he means most people, but surely not me." But Paul does not stop with a general summary. He moves closer. He begins to examine the human body, piece by piece. He moves from the throat to the tongue, to the lips, to the mouth, down to the feet, and finally up to the eyes. He says, "Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways. And there is no fear of God before their eyes." This is a terrifying portrait. But look closer at what Paul is actually describing. He focuses heavily on the organs of speech and communication. The throat, the tongue, the lips, and the mouth. The deeply religious person in Rome might protest. They might say, "I have never murdered anyone. My hands are clean. I do not live like the pagans out in the street." But Paul bypasses the hands and goes straight to the mouth. He shows that you do not need a physical weapon to destroy the image of God in another human being. The venom is already on your lips. The decay of an open grave is already in your throat. When you use your words to tear down, to deceive, or to elevate yourself above someone else, you are participating in the exact same decay as the rest of the world. Sin is not just an occasional mistake. It is not a minor scratch on the surface of human nature. It is a total infection. It has compromised every faculty, every instinct, and every action. When modern readers encounter this passage, we often try to soften it. We want to defend human nature. We want to believe that deep down, people are basically good. But Paul refuses to soften the diagnosis. A doctor who lies about the severity of a terminal illness is not being kind. To prepare the patient for the cure, the doctor must show them the full reality of the disease. This long, dark sequence of judgment, which began all the way back in chapter 1, finally reaches its conclusion in Romans chapter 3, verse 19. Paul hands down the final verdict. He writes that, "Whatever the law says, it says so, that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God." Every mouth silenced. That is the entire goal of the first 3 chapters of Romans. The goal was never to give the church a new list of moral rules. The goal was silence. The goal was to bring the arrogant, noisy, self-justifying human race to a place of absolute quiet before a holy God. The pagan has run out of excuses. The religious insider has dropped their resume. The defense attorney has sat down. The courtroom is finally silent. The trap has worked. The ground is level. The darkness is total. But precisely at this moment, in the very next breath, Paul writes 2 of the most important words in human history. The entire courtroom has been brought to absolute silence. Every human defense has been dismantled. And into that total silence, Paul drops 2 of the most important words in human history. But now. In the original language, it is a sudden, dramatic pivot. It is not just a polite transition to a new paragraph. It is a breaking of the timeline. It is the announcement that the long, dark era of human self-justification is finally over, and a completely new reality has broken into the world. For 3 chapters, Paul has been digging. He dug through the dark layers of pagan corruption. He dug through the thick layers of religious hypocrisy. He dug all the way down to the throat, the tongue, and the hidden motives of the human heart. It felt like he was burying his readers under the weight of judgment. But he was not. He was excavating. Paul knows that you cannot build the massive cathedral of grace on the fragile sand of human effort. You have to dig all the way down to the bedrock. And in the biblical pattern, the only bedrock strong enough to hold the weight of the gospel is the undeniable reality of human inability. Only when the patient admits the disease is terminal can the cure actually be applied. And the cure arrives in Romans chapter 3, verse 21. Paul writes, "But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify." This is an explosion of light in a pitch-black room. For the religious believers in Rome, the phrase, "apart from the law," is staggering. The law was their identity. It was the boundary marker that separated them from the pagan world. It was the measuring stick they used to calculate their own holiness. But Paul tells them that the rescue operation does not come through the system they use to judge everyone else. Notice the shift in the text. Not human righteousness, God's righteousness. Not a status you achieve by performing well. A status you receive by trusting the promise. Not a ladder you climb to reach heaven. A rescue that descends to reach you. Paul then writes the sentence that is designed to permanently heal the fractured, divided church. In verses 22 through 24, he says, "This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace." Look closely at the echo in the text. Paul says they fall short of the glory of God. Back in chapter 1, Paul said humanity exchanged the glory of God for idols. The tragedy of chapter 1 has become the universal condition of chapter 3. But because the condition is universal, the grace can be universal too. There is no difference. That is the ultimate payoff of Paul's dangerous trap. That is why he spent 3 long chapters tearing down the dividing walls of human pride. The bad news was the great equalizer, so that the good news could be the great unifier. If the religious insider and the pagan outsider are standing in the exact same courtroom, totally condemned by their own rebellion, then they can only be saved by the exact same rescue. They are no longer rivals, competing for God's approval. They are co-heirs, receiving God's mercy. Grace is no longer a reward for the moralist. It is a resurrection for the dead. When you see the sequence in full, it completely changes how you view the bad news of chapter 1. If Paul had started his letter with grace, the church in Rome would have misunderstood it completely. They would have treated the gospel like a cheap accessory to their own self-righteousness. The moralist would have thought grace was a reward for keeping the rules. The intellectual would have thought grace was a reward for having the right theology. The proud would have taken the beautiful gift of justification and used it as just another weapon to look down on the people out in the streets. Grace added to a proud heart does not create gratitude, it creates arrogance. This is why the long, dark sequence of the opening chapters was absolutely necessary. The bad news of chapter 1, the sudden trap of chapter 2, and the devastating autopsy of chapter 3 were not punishments, they were preparations. Paul had to strip away every illusion of human goodness before he could introduce the reality of divine love. And because he did the hard work of excavation first, the promises of the later chapters land with incredible, earth-shaking power. Look at Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. Paul writes, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Pause for a second and look at the specific words Paul chooses. Powerless, ungodly, sinners. If Paul had not spent 3 long chapters proving that every human being fits into those 3 categories, we would misread chapter 5. We would instinctively think that Christ died for the pretty good. We would assume he died for the moral. We would think he died for the people who were trying their best. But the sequence of Romans proves that there are no good people. There is no one righteous, not even one. Human beings naturally want to bring something to the table of salvation. We want to contribute. We want to hand God a resume. The moralist brings their discipline. The religious insider brings their traditions. But the first 3 chapters of Romans are God systematically overturning the table. He refuses to negotiate with human pride. He will not accept a partial surrender. God does not meet us halfway. He goes all the way down to the bottom of our ruin, to the place where our mouths are completely silenced, and He rescues us there. He does not ask us to clean ourselves up before He arrives. He arrives while we are still ungodly, not after we fix our behavior, while we are still powerless, not when we finally understand the theology, while we are still sinners. This is the profound, beautiful purpose of the dark backdrop. The severity of the disease is the only thing that reveals the absolute miracle of the cure. When you realize that you had absolutely nothing to offer, the fact that God offered you everything changes you forever. It breaks your pride. It softens your heart toward other broken people. It turns a fractured, divided room of arrogant people into a unified family of the forgiven. And this leaves us with one final realization about how we read the whole book of Romans. We have traveled through the most difficult chapters in the New Testament. We watched Paul systematically dismantle every human defense mechanism. He started with the pagan world, describing how God sorrowfully handed them over to the consequences of their own desires. He turned the mirror onto the religious moralist, exposing the pride hidden underneath their rule-keeping. He performed a devastating autopsy on the human heart, leaving the entire world completely silenced before God. And then, into that absolute silence, he announced the arrival of a grace that rescues the ungodly. When you view the opening of Romans this way, the wrath of God no longer looks like an unpredictable emotional outburst. It does not look like a sudden loss of divine control. It looks exactly like what the biblical pattern always intended it to be. God's wrath is His holy, unyielding resistance to everything that destroys what He loves. He loves His creation too much to allow us to comfortably destroy ourselves. He loves humanity too much to let us survive on the illusion of our own goodness. If He did not expose the terminal reality of our condition, we would never accept the cure. We would just keep building religious ladders, trying to climb our way out of a grave. The bad news of the first 3 chapters is not a threat. It is a diagnosis, and that diagnosis changes how we read the rest of the letter. Because Paul started with the absolute, universal condemnation of chapter 1, the great promises of the later chapters carry an entirely different weight. Think about the most famous declaration in the entire book. In Romans, chapter 8, verse 1, Paul writes, "Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." That sentence is beautiful on its own. But when you place it against the dark velvet backdrop of the first 3 chapters, it is earth-shaking. The people receiving that promise are the exact same people from the opening argument. They are the ones whose throats were open graves. They are the ones who passed judgment on others while doing the exact same things. They are the ones who were totally powerless, completely ungodly, and entirely under the power of sin. They deserved the silence of chapter 3. But instead, they received the grace of chapter 5. And because they did not earn that grace, they can never lose it. If you earn your standing with God through your own moral performance, you will spend the rest of your life terrified that you might lose it. You will live in constant anxiety, constantly checking your spiritual resume, wondering if you are finally good enough. But Paul has permanently destroyed the resume. He has proven that justification is not a wage you earn. It is a gift you receive. The sequence of bad news was the necessary fire to burn away the anxiety of human performance. It leaves us with absolutely no room for boasting, and it leaves us with nothing but profound gratitude. It shows us that the Christian life is not about pretending we are better than the rest of the world. It is about admitting we are just as broken, and pointing to the one who rescued us anyway. If this study has helped you see the book of Romans with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so we can continue uncovering the deep patterns of Scripture together. Paul did not start his masterpiece with wrath to terrify his readers. He started in the dark so that the light of the cross would be unmistakable. The sequence of the bad news was never just a theological argument. It was the quiet architecture of our redemption.